Two people are hired on the exact same day, for the exact same job, at the exact same salary. Same city, same rent range, same offer letter, almost word for word. If you lined up their first paychecks side by side, you wouldn't find a single dollar of difference. 10 years later, one of them owns a home outright and has enough saved to take a year off if she wanted to. The other is still checking her account balance before she buys groceries, still one bad month away from a credit card she can't pay off. Same income, same decade, two completely different lives. If you assume this story ends with one of them getting a big raise, or a lucky break, or an inheritance, it doesn't. Their income stayed almost identical the entire time. Promotions came at the same pace. Raises landed within a few $100s of each other, year after year. So what actually happened? There's a version of this story where the answer is obvious. Maybe one of them got a secret bonus. Maybe one married into money, or inherited a house, or made a lucky bet on a stock that took off. That's the version we're trained to expect, because it's the version that lets us keep believing the paycheck is the whole story. But go back and check the record. The pay stubs, the tax filings, the raises. And none of that happened. Their W-2S, stapled together, would look almost like a clerical error, two names on documents that are otherwise nearly identical. No windfall, no rich relative, no secret side income either of them ever mentioned. Which means the answer to what separated them isn't hiding in some dramatic event. It's hiding somewhere much quieter, somewhere so unremarkable that if you'd watched their first year of paychecks side by side, in real time, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything happening at all. This is the question that quietly undoes one of the most common beliefs about money. The idea that if you just earned more, everything would sort itself out. That the problem is the number on the paycheck, not what happens to it after it lands. The truth is stranger and more useful than that. Let's call them the first analyst and the second analyst, because that's really all that separated them on day one. Two junior analysts at a mid-sized insurance company, both 24 years old, both starting at $61,000 a year, both a little nervous, both carrying student loans that felt enormous at the time and would look almost quaint a decade later. They sat 2 desks apart. They went to the same new hire orientation. They even joked, that first week, about getting the same coffee order by accident. For the first few months, nothing separated them. They were, statistically, the same person. Then something happened that neither of them thought was important. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like paperwork. During orientation, HR handed out a benefits packet. Buried on page 14 was a line about automatic retirement contributions and a separate, optional form for a recurring transfer into a savings account. Most new hires skimmed past it. It looked like the kind of thing you'd deal with later. The first analyst filled it out that afternoon, mostly because the HR rep sitting across from her offered to walk her through it right then, and it was easier to say yes than to say, "I'll do it myself." A small percentage of every paycheck would move automatically. Retirement contribution first, then a separate transfer into a savings account she'd never actually see hit her checking balance. The second analyst meant to fill it out too. She just wanted to wait until she had a better sense of her budget. A reasonable thing to want. She filed the form in a drawer. Neither of them thought about that drawer again for a long time. There was no argument, no moment of tension, not even a conversation about it. The second analyst simply meant to circle back once her first paycheck cleared, and she could see the real numbers instead of guessing at them. It was a reasonable plan. It was also a plan that quietly assumed her future self would have more clarity, more time, and more motivation than her present self did. An assumption that, for almost everyone, turns out to be optimistic. The first paycheck landed for both of them on the same Friday. The first analyst opened her banking app, saw a number slightly smaller than she expected, shrugged, and went on with her weekend. She didn't feel like she'd done anything. She hadn't, really. The form had done it for her. The second analyst opened her banking app, saw the full amount sitting there, felt a small wave of relief after months of job-hunting anxiety, and decided she'd earned a nice dinner to celebrate. Which she had. That wasn't the mistake. There was no mistake. Not yet. There was just a fork. That drawer became the fork in the road. Not because one of them made a smarter financial calculation. Not because one of them read more books about money. Because one small system got switched on, and the other didn't. This is where it's worth pausing on something researchers who study financial behavior have found again and again. The biggest predictor of whether someone builds savings isn't how much they earn, and it isn't even how disciplined they are. It's whether saving happens automatically, before they ever have the chance to decide. Picture two rivers starting from the exact same spring. One is diverted, early and gently, into a reservoir before it ever reaches the open plain. The other flows freely. And a free-flowing river, given an open plain, will always find a way to spread out, pool in low places, and evaporate in the sun. That's what happened to the second analyst's income. It wasn't wasted on anything dramatic. It just spread out. A slightly nicer apartment, because rent felt manageable on paper. A few more dinners out, because after a stressful week, why not? A subscription here, an upgrade there. None of it reckless. All of it invisible. The way water disappearing into dry ground is invisible. One small evaporation at a time. 18 months in, the first analyst hadn't thought about her savings account in months. She genuinely couldn't have told you the exact balance. That wasn't laziness. It was the opposite. The system had been built specifically so she wouldn't have to think about it. Decisions, once made and automated, stop costing willpower. She never had to summon the discipline to transfer money because there was no moment where transferring money was a choice at all. The second analyst, meanwhile, was trying to do something much harder. Every single month, she was attempting to make the same good decision fresh, to look at what was left after expenses and consciously choose to set some aside. And every single month, that decision was competing against decision fatigue, against a hard day, against a friend's birthday dinner, against the completely human instinct to reward herself for working so hard in the first place. Here's the part that surprises most people when they hear it for the first time. She wasn't undisciplined. In almost every measurable way, she was just as capable, just as intelligent, just as hardworking as the woman 2 desks over. She simply inherited a much harder version of the same task, a version that had to be won in a small mental negotiation every 30 days for years. Willpower, it turns out, is a terrible long-term financial strategy. Not because people lack it, but because it's a finite resource, and life is very good at spending it before you get to your bank account. This is where the documentary could simply tell you the moral and move on. But the real story doesn't stop at year 1. It barely begins there. Around year 2, both women faced almost the same emergency, 3 months apart. A transmission failure, the kind of repair that arrives without warning and without mercy, quoted at just under $2,000. For the first analyst, it was an annoyance. She transferred the money from the account she'd forgotten she was building, felt a brief pang at watching the number drop, and moved on with her week. The system had done exactly what it was built for. It had turned an emergency into an inconvenience. For the second analyst, the same repair bill became a decision with no good options. She didn't have it sitting anywhere. She put it on a card at 22% interest, telling herself she'd pay it off within a couple of months. Life, predictably, had other plans. A slow month at work turned into a slower one. The balance lingered, then grew, quietly accumulating interest in the background, the same patient, compounding way the first analyst's savings were quietly growing in hers, except working against her instead of for her. That's the detail that rarely gets said out loud. Compounding doesn't take sides. It will build a future, or it will build a debt, with the same silent persistence either way. It simply amplifies whatever direction you're already moving in. Fast forward 3 years. Both women get promoted within a few months of each other. Both raises land close enough that if you graphed their incomes, the lines would look almost identical. Occasionally crossing, mostly moving together, like 2 dancers who've never quite lost step with each other. But something else was compounding in the background, and it had nothing to do with their salaries. The first analyst's automatic contributions had, without her ever increasing them by choice, been growing anyway. Not because she was actively investing more, but because her contribution was a percentage, and her income had grown. The system scaled itself. She never had to notice, decide, or intervene. Meanwhile, her account had quietly crossed into territory where growth was no longer just about what she put in. It was starting to grow because of what was already there. The slow, unglamorous mathematics of money making money, a process so gradual it's almost boring to watch and almost impossible to appreciate until you look back and do the math. The second analyst had also tried to start investing around this time. She'd read an article, gotten motivated, opened an account, and put in a few $100s. Then a car repair came up. Then a wedding she was in as a bridesmaid, with all the costs that come attached to that particular honor. The investment account sat mostly untouched, sometimes even paused, restarted, paused again. Not because she didn't care about her future, but because without a system, her future was competing against every single present-tense emergency, and the present usually won. This is the part where most financial content would tell you to simply be more disciplined. But that's a little like telling someone standing in a river to simply stop getting wet. The problem was never a lack of caring. It was the absence of a structure that didn't depend on caring every single day. To her credit, the second analyst tried. Around year 4, she downloaded a budgeting app, color-coded her categories, and spent an entire Sunday afternoon entering every transaction from the past 3 months by hand. For about 6 weeks, it worked beautifully. She checked it every morning with her coffee, the way some people check the weather. Then a demanding stretch at work arrived. Long days, late nights, the kind of exhaustion that makes even small tasks feel enormous. And the daily check-ins slipped to weekly, then monthly, then stopped entirely. The app was still there, technically. It just required something she no longer had enough of by the end of each day: attention. This is not a story about a woman who failed at budgeting. It's a story about a tool that demanded daily engagement in a life that couldn't reliably supply it. The first analyst's system had never once asked her for a Sunday afternoon. It didn't need her attention to function. It had been built to survive her worst weeks, not just her best ones. And that difference alone is closer to the real dividing line between the two of them than any single financial decision either woman ever made. There's a well-documented pattern that shows up again and again in people who come into sudden money. Lottery winners, professional athletes, early and high-earning careers, even lucky startup employees who cash out early. A striking number of them end up financially worse off within a few years, despite incomes most people would consider life-changing. It's not that the money vanished into anything glamorous or foolish, necessarily. It's that a huge income, dropped into a life with no system to catch it, behaves exactly like water on an open plain. It spreads out. It evaporates. It disappears one reasonable-sounding expense at a time, which means the story we tend to tell ourselves. I'd save more if I earned more. Has it backward more often than not. Income is water. Systems are the riverbed. Without the riverbed, more water doesn't create a lake. It just floods a wider, shallower area and evaporates a little faster. By year 6, the gap between the two analysts had gone from invisible to unmistakable. The first analyst had never once described herself as a saver. She didn't clip coupons. She didn't track every purchase in a spreadsheet. She bought nice things sometimes. What she had was a paycheck that had been quietly, automatically splitting itself in two the moment it arrived. One part for her present life, one part for a future she'd stopped having to think about because it was already being built without her. The second analyst, by contrast, had become somebody who thought about money constantly. And this is the detail that tends to surprise people most. She wasn't careless. She was one of the most financially anxious people in her office because she was fighting the same battle every single month with nothing but willpower, and willpower, unlike a system, gets tired. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from making the same decision over and over and losing just often enough that you never build any momentum. It's not the exhaustion of failure. It's the exhaustion of a fair fight that never ends. Around year 7, both women were promoted into management roles within the same quarter, and the company threw a small gathering to market. Cheap sparkling wine in plastic cups, the kind of office celebration that's more gesture than party. They ended up talking for a while, the way people who once sat 2 desks apart sometimes do, catching up on a decade that had happened almost side by side without either of them noticing how far it had actually diverged. The second analyst mentioned, half joking, that she still hadn't figured out the money thing. The first analyst almost said something about her accounts, then stopped herself, because it felt strange to explain that she hadn't really figured it out either. Not in the sense of some hard-won discipline. She'd just stopped having to think about it years ago, and the not thinking had done more for her than any amount of thinking ever could have. She didn't say that. It would have sounded like bragging, and it wasn't. It was closer to describing the weather in a city she no longer lived in. Around this point in the story, it's worth stepping back and asking the harder question underneath all of this. Not, what should you do with your money, But why does anyone believe more income solves this in the first place? Part of the answer is that income is visible. It's the number on the offer letter, the figure you say out loud at a dinner party, the thing you can compare against a friend's. Systems are invisible. Nobody brags about the percentage they automatically root into an index fund the day it arrives. It doesn't feel like an accomplishment in the moment. It feels like nothing at all, which is exactly why it works, and exactly why it's so easy to underestimate. We tend to believe that the visible thing is the important thing. But wealth, it turns out, is built almost entirely in the invisible layer. In the defaults, the automations, the decisions made once, instead of decided fresh every month. Think about how strange it is that we can name a friend's job title and rough salary within a few minutes of meeting them, but we'd have no idea whether they have 3 months of expenses saved or 3 days. One of those numbers is a conversation topic. The other is the actual determinant of whether a bad month becomes a bad year. We've simply built a culture that talks constantly about the number that matters less and almost never about the one that matters more. By year 10, the two analysts' salaries were still within a few $1,000s of each other. On paper, to a stranger glancing at their pay stubs, they looked like the same financial story. But one had a paid-off car, 6 months of expenses saved as a cushion, a retirement account that had crossed into 6 figures almost entirely on autopilot, and something harder to put a number on. A kind of quiet, unspoken calm about money. Not because she was rich, because she wasn't afraid of it anymore. The other had a slightly nicer wardrobe, a slightly nicer apartment, memories from slightly more vacations, and almost nothing set aside. Not because she'd made worse choices in any single moment, because she'd been asked to make the right choice, alone, unaided, hundreds of times in a row, and no one is built to win that streak indefinitely. If you sat the two of them down and asked each to describe the other decade, side by side, they'd probably both undersell what actually happened. The first analyst would likely say she got a little lucky and just never really touched her savings, as if the outcome had assembled itself. The second analyst would likely say she just never got around to fixing her finances, as if the missing piece was a weekend she never found. Neither explanation is quite honest, and neither woman is being dishonest on purpose. It's simply very hard to see a system, or the absence of one, from the inside. 10 years of small, invisible defaults don't feel like 10 years of anything. They feel like nothing happened at all, which, in a sense, is exactly the point. If you only remember one thing from this, let it not be a lesson about spreadsheets or budgeting apps or clever tricks. Let it be this. The version of you with better outcomes 10 years from now probably won't be the version who tried harder in any given month. It'll be the version who needed to try the least, because she built something, early and small and boring, that kept working long after she stopped thinking about it. Money doesn't reward the person who fights for it the hardest. It rewards the person who stopped having to fight for it at all.